Miss Marple and the trouble at the parish picnic. Hello, dear friends. It is a pleasure to have you back with us this evening at Warm Chapters. I'm Thomas, and I'm truly grateful for each of you who returns to spend these quiet and curious hours in our little growing circle. Do tell us where you are listening from and what the temperature is in your corner of the world just now. And if you have not yet subscribed, do join us for more daily mysteries. Now then, settle back, make yourselves comfortable, and let us begin. Chapter 1. Beneath the elms, the blankets were laid. The annual parish picnic of St. Mary Mead had, by long custom, achieved that rare village distinction of being at once thoroughly organised and entirely predictable. Anyone who had attended it for 10 years or more could have foretold, with fair confidence, which families would appear early with military punctuality, which would come later under the guise of elegance and leisure, and which would arrive flushed, apologetic, and carrying some hasty offering from the village shop in place of what they had quite certainly meant to prepare the night before. The meadow beyond the river bend had hosted the occasion for so many years that no one any longer recalled when the arrangement had begun. Its gentle rise, its broad patch of level grass, and the line of old elms at the upper edge gave the place the air of having been designed expressly for respectable parish recreation. It was the last Saturday of July, and the morning had dawned clear and warm beneath one of those pale blue English skies so uncommon and so perfectly judged that people afterwards spoke of it for weeks, as though Providence had arranged it for their exclusive enjoyment. By 10 o'clock, the meadow was well occupied. Folding tables had been set up near the elm trees and covered with white cloths, the corners lifting and settling whenever the faintest breeze strayed across the grass. Wicker hampers of every shape and degree of ambition had been deposited upon rugs, blankets, and squares of oilcloth. Children darted to and fro with the purposeless urgency peculiar to healthy youth, while their elders called after them in tones which implied discipline but betrayed indulgence. Miss Jane Marple arrived at 11:15, carrying her canvas bag, her knitting, and that composed expression which long experience gives to those who have discovered that a surprisingly large amount may be learned from sitting still in the right place. She was slight and delicately made, dressed in a pale grey frock with a soft lavender cardigan, for she had never in her life made the mistake of trusting an English summer merely because it had begun well. Her white hair was neatly arranged beneath a broad straw hat, and she carried an old striped sunshade in cream and green, which had been in her possession for many years, and to which she was, in her quiet way, rather attached. A young man from the vicarage, earnest, sun-warmed, and already faintly perspiring, helped her choose a place. She thanked him with genuine warmth, for Miss Marple always distinguished between kindness offered freely and kindness performed from duty, and settled herself at the upper end of the meadow, where the nearest elm cast a comfortable patch of shade over her chair without excluding her from a view of the company. It was, she thought, an admirable position. From there she could observe the picnic as a whole as it formed, loosened, and shifted upon the grass like some living village map. Closest to her, and quite impossible not to notice, was Mrs. Harriet Pemberley, who was generally recognised in St. Mary Mead as the practical force behind the entire occasion. Mrs. Pemberley was a tall woman of about 60, erect of carriage and exact of habit, with silver-grey hair arranged in a style apparently selected decades earlier and never reconsidered. She wore a dark blue poplin dress and moved with the air of a person to whom inefficiency was not merely inconvenient, but faintly immoral. For 11 years she had served on the parish committee, and she managed its affairs with the grave efficiency of a woman who had never entirely reconciled herself to the world's preference for muddle. At present, she was consulting a small notebook with the concentration of a campaign strategist and directing the placement of the trestle table that was to hold the donation box for the church roof repair fund. The box itself was plain, dark green, with a brass slot and a brass lock, and had served for several parish collections. Its reappearance each year had become one of those village constants which inspire a mild but genuine affection. The care of it, on this occasion, had been entrusted to Mr. Gerald Whitton. Mr. Whitton was a middle-aged man of agreeable and rather undistinguished appearance, the sort of person of whom people say, when pressed for an opinion, that he is perfectly pleasant, and then find themselves unable to improve upon the description. He was of average height, a little stout at the middle, with mild features and brown hair retreating from his forehead in a manner at once dignified and resigned. He worked in insurance, or in something close enough to insurance that nobody had ever thought it worth distinguishing, and had served on the parish committee for 3 years without incident, distinction, or complaint. He liked cricket, his sister's fruitcake, and helpful duties that did not involve immediate crisis. When he accepted responsibility for the donation box that morning, he had done so with his customary good nature, and had placed it upon the trestle table with every appearance of competence. A little beyond the table, arranged at such a distance as to suggest nearness without participation, stood Mrs. Clarice Norwood. She was a woman of perhaps 55, neat, self-possessed, and economical in all she did. Her dark eyes missed very little, though she had long ago mastered the useful art of seeing without seeming to watch. In the village, she was known for her meticulous habits. Her garden was the best kept in her lane. Her household accounts were said to balance to the penny. Her contributions to parish functions were always exactly what she had promised. Never careless, never excessive, never spontaneous. She had brought with her a hamper of imposing orderliness, every plate, napkin, and parcel inside it. It arranged as though she had considered the question from several angles before committing herself. She wore a pale blue linen skirt and a white blouse, and on her left lapel there was pinned a silver brooch shaped like a spray of forget-me-nots. Miss Marple's eyes rested on that brooch for a brief moment. Then they moved on. Some little distance from the principal body of the gathering, nearer the path to the river, was Miss Adelaide Trench. She was around 40, a schoolteacher both by profession and in a number of her habits of mind. She had dark, neatly arranged hair and a manner brisk enough in classrooms, though somewhat less secure among village sociabilities. She served as assistant to the parish treasurer, a duty she had undertaken 2 years earlier and discharged with exactness. This morning, however, she had the air of a person preoccupied by something she had not yet decided whether to reveal. Her complexion was rather brighter than the warmth of the day justified, and she held her glass of lemonade in both hands, as though grateful to have them employed. Miss Marple noticed all of this in her usual way, not greedily, not theatrically, but as one notices weather or soil or the condition of a hedge, quietly, continuously, and with a memory trained by long use. Luncheon was served at 12 and managed with the efficiency of old custom. Tables were shifted, hampers opened, recipes admired, and the talk of the gathering acquired that special holiday quality which differs from ordinary conversation by being less structured, less guarded, and therefore considerably more revealing. Children were fed first and sent off towards the river under the care of a young curate, whose patient courage did not go unappreciated. Miss Marple ate one cucumber and cream cheese sandwich, declined a second, and accepted a small slice of seed cake with sincere pleasure. She listened to everything around her with the mild expression of a lady fully occupied with her own contentment, which was never at all the same thing as not listening. It was shortly after 2 o'clock, luncheon over, the afternoon mellowing beautifully, the temper of the company softened by food, sunlight and routine, that Mrs. Harriet Pemberley rose rather suddenly from her place beside the trestle table. The abruptness of it was enough to attract attention at once. Her face had altered. The brisk command with which she had supervised the morning had given place to something tighter and far less comfortable. There was a stiffness in her jaw and an unnatural brightness in her eyes. She put down her glass with a controlled movement and turned to face the company with the air of a woman who had already crossed some private threshold and did not intend to retreat. "I am sorry," she said, and her voice carried with extraordinary clearness across the meadow, "to raise a matter of this kind on such an occasion, but I find that I have no alternative." The picnic, which a moment earlier had been pleasantly noisy, fell into the sort of attentive silence only villages can produce at speed. "The funds collected this morning for the church roof repair," Mrs. Pemberley continued, "appear to be short. The amount in the donation box does not correspond with the total recorded in my notebook. The discrepancy is not a small one. Perhaps a cloud crossed the sun then, or perhaps Miss Marple merely felt one should have done." For the warmth seemed to leave the gathering all at once. Faces turned first towards the box, then toward Mr. Whitton, then uncertainly toward one another. Mr. Whitton himself stood quite still, and the look on his pleasant face was not outrage at first, but bewilderment. "I beg your pardon," he said, with the unhappy politeness of a man who would much prefer to have misheard. But he had not misheard. The implication descended over the meadow like a shadow not yet attached to any definite shape but unmistakably present. Money was missing. The box had been in one man's care. Mrs. Pemberley had not quite said more than that, but she had not needed to. Miss Marple laid down her knitting very softly and looked across the gathering. She observed Mr. Whitton, now beginning to protest with increasing earnestness. She observed Mrs. Norwood, who had turned her head toward the donation box with an expression so carefully neutral that it was itself almost expressive. She observed Miss Trench, who had gone very still indeed, and whose colour, if anything, had risen further. She observed Mrs. Pemberley, the set of her shoulders, the controlled position of her hands, the exact flavour of her agitation, and thought, with the quiet precision of long habit, that agitation might not be the truest word for it. Many faces showed surprise, as was natural. Several showed concern, as was decent. But here and there Miss Marple saw something else. Not shock, but a kind of readiness. The settled look of people who were not astonished so much as confirmed. That interested her. She took up her knitting once more, and the needles resumed their soft and regular clicking. Public humiliation, she reflected, has a cruelty that private injury often lacks. To accuse a person before the whole village, beneath the elm shade, with the river just beyond and every eye upon him, was seldom, in her experience, an impulsive act. Such things were usually prepared, if only in feeling. Yes, she thought, she must consider that, for she had the distinct impression that the missing money was not, in itself, the true heart of the matter. It was only the thing upon the surface, and beneath the surface, very often, lay the real scandal. Chapter 2. A picnic basket. Set to one side. The immediate effect of Mrs. Pemberley's announcement was not disorder, but something subtler and more revealing. The peculiar hush that falls upon a gathering when much is occurring at once, only very quietly and in several directions. Conversation resumed because it had to, for silence at a parish picnic is even more conspicuous than open discord. But it resumed altered in pitch and texture. Voices dropped. Laughter, when it appeared, did so too quickly. The meadow itself seemed to be listening. Miss Marple did not move from her place. Her knitting needles continued their gentle work while the afternoon rearranged itself around the disturbance. Mr. Gerald Whitton had by now recovered enough command of himself to speak with something approaching his ordinary steadiness. Though the strain of the effort was plain, he remained near the trestle table in the posture of a man determined to appear calm, which is very seldom the same thing as actually being calm, and addressed Mrs. Pemberley in a tone of admirable reasonableness. "I assure you," he said, "the box has not left my care this morning, not for any significant length of time." He paused, then added with the care of one trying not to be misquoted, "I put it on the table at 9 o'clock, as arranged, and I have been within sight of it ever since." "Within sight?" repeated Mrs. Pemberley. The phrase was innocent enough, yet she managed to give it the quality of a weakness. Mr. Whitton coloured. "I mean to say, I have not removed it, nor have I given anyone permission to do so. Whatever the count may show, it is not due to any action of mine." It was a respectable defence, and presented with sufficient firmness to sound credible. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that credibility and truth, while often on visiting terms, did not always occupy the same house. She made no judgment yet. She merely watched. What interested her first was the matter of the hamper. In the course of his explanation, Mr. Whitton mentioned that the donation box had, at one point during the morning, rested not on the table itself, but on the grass beside a particular hamper, one with dark green and cream checks upon the leather straps, placed a little to the left of the trestle table, and rather apart from the general pattern of the picnic. It was, of course, Mrs. Clarice Norwood's hamper. According to Mr. Whitton, the circumstance had arisen because one of the vicarage children had knocked the trestle table slightly askew early in the morning. While it was being righted, he had set the box down beside the nearest convenient object. The nearest object, unfortunately or otherwise, had been Mrs. Norwood's basket. At the mention of her hamper, Mrs. Norwood received the information with the controlled expression of a woman compelled to acknowledge something she would greatly have preferred left unmentioned. She stood perhaps 4 feet from the table, her hands lightly folded before her. The arrangement suggested composure. The fingers, Miss Marple noticed, did not quite support the impression. "I was not aware," said Mrs. Norwood, "that the box had been placed beside my hamper." "It was only for a few minutes," said Mr. Whitton, in a placating tone. "A few minutes," repeated Mrs. Norwood. Her inflection made the words sound suspiciously like evidence. "I see, and I am to suppose that this proximity is somehow relevant." No one answered her directly, which was, in a way, answer enough. The suggestion lingered among the company like a small cloud not yet heavy enough for rain, but uncomfortable all the same. Nobody wished to claim it. Nobody wished to dismiss it. Miss Marple changed to a slightly darker shade of wool. It was then that Miss Adelaide Trench spoke. She did so with the manner of a person who has been waiting for a suitable opening and has finally decided that a merely adequate one must do. "I wonder," she said, addressing nobody in particular and everybody at once, "whether the total may simply have been miscounted. Such things do happen. a line added twice, a coin put in the wrong place, an error in tallying. In my own experience with the Parish accounts, discrepancies are sometimes arithmetic before they are anything else. It was a sensible remark and, on the surface, a kindly one. Several faces in the gathering responded with visible relief, grateful for any explanation that might allow the matter to retreat into harmlessness. But Miss Marple noticed, as she often noticed, the thing just to one side of the obvious. In making the suggestion, Miss Trench had glanced not at Mr. Whitton, nor at Mrs. Norwood, but at Mrs. Pemberley. The glance was brief, but it contained something more than general concern. It was the look of someone checking a reaction, or perhaps of someone who already knew there was something to check. Mrs. Pemberley received the suggestion with the measured courtesy accorded to remarks one does not intend to accept. "I have counted the sum twice," she said. "My notebook is perfectly clear. There is a deficit, and it is not a matter of arithmetic." That disposed of the idea with uncomfortable finality. Miss Trench fell silent, and a faint flush rose along her cheekbones. By now, a number of those closest to the table had gathered enough from tone and fragments to understand that the missing amount, while certainly noticeable, was not particularly large. It was enough to matter to the roof fund, and enough to provoke embarrassment, but not enough to tempt a truly determined thief into elaborate risk. Miss Marple considered that very carefully. Large sums, in her experience, were taken by people who had decided upon theft before they committed it. Smaller sums belonged to a different category altogether. They suggested impulse, opportunity, panic, or else the sort of removal intended to be temporary, with replacement imagined for later, and later, so often, failed to arrive. She let her gaze travel, apparently idly, over the scene near the table. The donation box still sat where it had sat all afternoon, its dark green paint proper and unremarkable, its brass fittings catching the sunlight whenever the leaves above shifted. It had the solid, dutiful air of an object meant to stand for trust. Miss Marple felt an odd sympathy for it. Such objects were forever being burdened with the moral failures of human beings. Then she considered the hamper. Mrs. Norwood's basket was the largest among those brought by the parish committee ladies, which was entirely in keeping with Mrs. Norwood's principles of preparation. It rested on a carefully placed square of oilcloth, she had remarked earlier, to prevent any damp from rising into the wicker. Its position, apart from the central arrangement, had not been accidental. Mrs. Norwood had said, quite distinctly, and in the hearing of the vicar's wife, that she liked to keep her things where she could see them. That, Miss Marple thought, was interesting. The hamper had been placed apart by design. The box had been placed beside it by circumstance. Mr. Whitton had been occupied with the table. Mrs. Norwood claimed not to have noticed the proximity. It was not impossible, but neither was it entirely comfortable. Miss Marple found herself wondering, with that mild persistence, which in her was often more effective than urgency, what else that morning had stood very near something important, without seeming to notice it at all. Presently she became aware, one always does become aware, after a little time, that Mrs. Norwood was looking at her, not with open hostility. Mrs. Norwood was much too controlled a woman for anything as plain as that, but there was alertness in the gaze, and caution, the look of someone who has realized she herself is being observed, and is not quite certain how dangerous that observation may prove. Miss Marple met her eyes and smiled. It was the innocent, kindly, faintly vague smile which elderly ladies in cardigans are so often permitted to wear, and which, for that reason, can be among the most useful expressions in the world. Mrs. Norwood looked away first. Around them, the parish picnic gradually resumed its outward shape. Children drifted back from the river. Remaining sandwiches were offered round with commendable democracy. Talk rose once more, though not fully to its former level. The atmosphere had the quality of a room freshly aired after an unpleasant scene. One sensed the open windows, certainly, but one also sensed what had been there before. Mr. Whitton crossed to the far side of the trestle table and busied himself in straightening objects, which had no earthly need of straightening. Mrs. Norwood repacked one corner of her hamper with concentrated care. Mrs. Pemberley stood with her notebook in hand and said very little, having already said more than enough. Miss Adelaide Trench drifted to the lemonade table, poured herself another glass, and remained there, drinking in small, thoughtful sips, with the troubled air of a woman debating whether silence is wiser than speech. Miss Marple completed a row of knitting, turned the work, and began the next. A village, she reflected, resembled a well-kept garden more closely than most people ever supposed. It required labour, certainly, and order, and the regular trimming away of unpleasantness at the visible edges. But what mattered most was not what flourished openly. It was what was planted too close, what had been moved deliberately apart, and what sent out roots under the surface where no one was expected to look. The hamper had been placed apart by its owner's intention. The box had been set beside it by chance, or so it was said. Between those two facts lay a small space, and it was very often in such spaces, Miss Marple knew, that the truth sat quietly waiting. She would think about it all with care, for she had not the least doubt now that there was more here than a trifling shortage in the church roof fund. There was motive somewhere, there was history, and most likely of all, there was someone in that pleasant meadow who was far more frightened than the missing coins alone could possibly explain. Chapter 3. An Allegation Raised Over Lemonade. There is in every village gathering a particular moment after something unfortunate has been said in public and before it has been settled, when each person present makes a private adjustment of position. The adjustment is rarely conscious enough to be named, and would certainly never be admitted aloud, but it is made all the same. One decides, quietly and without drama, where one's sympathies are to rest, where one's eyes are to turn, and with whom one will be seen to speak. By 3:00, the meadow had arranged itself accordingly, with the unconscious efficiency villages bring to these matters. Near the elm roots, a small cluster of ladies had gathered around Mr. Whitton, and were engaging him with such marked cordiality that, while their kindness was genuine enough, it also conveyed unmistakably that they considered the implication against him absurd. Among them stood his younger sister, who had come up from Dorchester for the day, and whose expression suggested that, had society permitted it, she would have liked very much to challenge the entire parish committee at once and have done with the business. On the opposite side of the meadow, nearer the river path, a quieter and more compact group had formed around Mrs. Pemberley. These were chiefly women from the parish committee, those who had worked beside her for years, and who were now expressing support in that particularly English way, which consists not in declarations, but in remaining steadily nearby and giving the impression that one's presence itself is evidence. Mrs. Norwood, meanwhile, stood apart from both groups exactly as she had stood a little apart from the general picnic that morning. She seemed perfectly content with isolation, which in itself was perhaps significant. She had poured herself tea from the committee table and was drinking it with an expression of composed detachment that Miss Marple, upon reflection, found a shade too composed for a woman whose name had just been drawn, however delicately, into a question of missing parish funds. As for Miss Adelaide Trench, she had drifted back from the lemonade table and stationed herself at an intermediate distance from everybody, which might have meant either that she had not yet decided where her loyalties lay, or else that she understood the social arithmetic of the situation rather better than most, and had judged neutrality, or the appearance of it, to be the safest available ground. Miss Marple observed all this from her rug with the same patient attention she brought to knitting, village gardens, and the moral habits of human beings. She had also by this time consumed 2 cups of tea, and what she privately considered to be the finest piece of shortbread she had encountered in several years, contributed by the wife of a local farmer, and unmistakably the product of a recipe that had not suffered the indignity of modern improvement. It was while reflecting on the many virtues of shortbread left sensibly alone that Mrs. Pemberley crossed the meadow and seated herself in a folding chair some 3 feet from Miss Marple's rug. She did this without ceremony and without the preliminary hesitation politeness might usually suggest. Mrs. Pemberley was not, as a rule, a woman who advanced tentatively towards anything. She sat, settled her skirt with precision, and looked out over the meadow with the expression of a person who had something to say and had chosen her listener with care. Miss Marple went on knitting and waited. "You have been very quiet, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Pemberley at last. The remark was framed as an observation, though it carried the faintest suggestion of inquiry. "I am generally quiet at picnics," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I am not quite as energetic as I once was, and I have found that sitting still provides one with a very tolerable view of what is going on." Mrs. Pemberley accepted this with outward ease, though Miss Marple suspected she was not deceived in the least. Mrs. Pemberley was by no means a foolish woman. The difficulty with her intelligence, Miss Marple thought, was that she tended to use it in support of conclusions she had already reached, which made it less flexible than it might otherwise have been. "I should like it to be understood," Mrs. Pemberley said, lowering her voice into that careful register which was meant to suggest discretion, while remaining quite audible in still afternoon air, "that I have accused no one. I have merely stated a fact. The funds are short. That is all." "Quite so," said Miss Marple. "If others choose to draw inferences," Mrs. Pemberley continued, "that is entirely their own doing." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, and her needles clicked softly. A little silence followed, and there was in it a fair amount of thought on both sides. "Mr. Whitton," said Mrs. Pemberley eventually, "is a perfectly amiable man. I have nothing against him personally." Miss Marple considered this. Such remarks, in her experience, generally introduced something less amiable than the speaker wished to admit. "I have always found him very pleasant," she said. "He was most obliging to Mrs. Fenwick last spring when her garden gate came off its hinge. A very willing neighbour." This was not, Miss Marple felt, quite the direction Mrs. Pemberley had hoped the conversation would take, and she adjusted herself accordingly. "The question," said Mrs. Pemberley, "is one of responsibility. When a person accepts charge of parish funds, vigilance is expected. I do not think that unreasonable." "Not unreasonable at all," Miss Marple agreed warmly. "Responsibility is a serious thing. I dare say even Mr. Whitton would say so himself, though he may perhaps feel this is an unfortunate moment in which to be reminded of it." Mrs. Pemberley cast her a brief look. "He left the box unattended." "He says he did not. He admitted he was occupied with the trestle table. One cannot attend properly to 2 things at once." Miss Marple allowed a very small pause before replying mildly, "I wonder whether Mrs. Norwood might have noticed anything, being so near. Her hamper, I understand, was beside the box for some little while. She is such an observant woman." The effect of this was slight, but distinct. Mrs. Pemberley's expression altered, not dramatically, for she was much too practiced in committee life to betray herself so crudely, but there was a small shift at the corners of her mouth and in the steadiness of her eyes. It might have been discomfort. It might, Miss Marple thought, have been something more precise. "Mrs. Norwood," said Mrs. Pemberley, after the briefest pause, "was not responsible for the box." "No," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I only meant that she might have seen something. One often notices a great deal about matters one is not directly attending to. At least, I have found so." Another pause. Above them, the elm leaves stirred, with a sound like a soft, communal sigh. "Mrs. Norwood and I," said Mrs. Pemberley, in the tone of a woman deciding to disclose something she would much rather have withheld, "are not close. We manage perfectly well together on the committee, of course, but we are not close." "I see," said Miss Marple, with the calm and kindly lack of surprise of a woman, to whom strained relations between respectable people had long since ceased to seem remarkable. "There have been misunderstandings in the past," said Mrs. Pemberley. "Old matters, the sort of things best left alone." She said this firmly, as one might erect a small fence around a flower bed one did not wish examined. Miss Marple did not press her. She had learned years ago that direct pressure rarely yielded the most interesting results. It was much more useful, generally, to wait and allow silence to do what questioning could not. She turned her knitting and began another row. "The afternoon has held up beautifully," she said, with every appearance of having wandered quite away from the previous subject. "I had rather expected cloud by 2 o'clock, but the sky has behaved very well indeed. Fortunate for the cricket." Mrs. Pemberley, who may perhaps have expected something more penetrating, looked faintly disconcerted. "Yes," she said, "quite fortunate." She remained another minute or two, then declared that she must return to the committee table and rose. She walked away with slightly less certainty than she had brought with her. Miss Marple watched her go. Mrs. Pemberley, she reflected, had made her announcement with all the composure of a woman expecting a particular outcome. Public accusations, and however politely phrased, this had certainly been one, were seldom made by people who merely wished to establish a fact. They were made by people who hoped the fact would do something for them, once set loose among others. The true question was what exactly Mrs. Pemberley had intended it to do. Across the meadow, Mr. Whitton was accepting a slice of Victoria sponge from the farmer's wife, and making, by all appearances, a brave effort at ordinary conversation. The effort showed in the set of his shoulders and in the slight over-carefulness of his smile. He looked to Miss Marple like a man who had been publicly humiliated and had resolved to conduct himself well in spite of it. She thought that rather admirable. Public embarrassment is one of the most miserable of social experiences, and to endure it with composure requires a kind of courage that often goes unnoticed, because it dresses itself in ordinary manners instead of heroics. Miss Trench, meanwhile, appeared at last to have made some decision regarding her own position. She had attached herself to the committee table with an air of dutiful purpose, and was handing round cups of tea with an efficiency a shade too energetic for the actual demands of the occasion. She did not once look directly at Mrs. Pemberley when giving her a cup, which Miss Marple found particularly interesting. The lemonade table now stood unattended, its pitcher half full, and glowing faintly in the afternoon light. Someone had left a glass beside it, and a small congregation of bees had formed around a spill on the cloth with the purposeful unanimity of creatures who knew exactly what they wanted and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Miss Marple looked at the lemonade table for a moment. Then she looked at Mrs. Pemberley, who had recovered her administrative composure and was speaking to the vicar's wife with the brisk steadiness of a woman returning to official business. She looked at Miss Trench, who was distributing the last of the cups and had placed herself so that her back was now turned to Mrs. Norwood. Then she looked at Mrs. Norwood, who was replacing the lid on her hamper with the air of a woman concluding some private matter. An accusation made before the lemonade had been poured, Miss Marple thought, was an accusation made before the afternoon had settled fully into ease, before the food was quite done with, before the company had scattered into those soft post-luncheon arrangements in which attention becomes difficult to command. It was, in other words, the earliest moment at which such a declaration could still count on an audience at its most concentrated. That was not the choice of a woman who had reluctantly spoken because circumstances forced her. That was the choice of a woman who had selected her moment. Miss Marple wound a fresh length of wool about her finger and considered the elm trees, the bend of the river, and the neat, active figure of Mrs. Pemberley moving among the committee tables with restored purpose. Yes, she thought, the afternoon had already been most instructive. Chapter 4. Coins tallied a second time. The matter of recounting the contents of the donation box descended upon the afternoon with the reluctant inevitability of something everyone knew must happen and nobody truly wished to begin. It was Mrs. Pemberley who raised the question again at around 3:30, by which time the post-luncheon arrangements had settled, and the younger members of the gathering had drifted down to the lower part of the meadow where the cricket match was being organised with immense seriousness and only moderate exactitude. The recount took place at the trestle table beneath the elm shade, before a small audience of 4, assembled partly by necessity and partly by selection. There was Mrs. Pemberley, who conducted the count. There was Mr. Whitton, who stood a little back from the table with his hands in his jacket pockets and the expression of a man called upon to witness his own inconvenience. There was Miss Adelaide Trench, who had offered to assist, an action which Miss Marple interpreted either as conscientious civic duty or a very deliberate form of positioning. And there was Miss Marple herself, who had accepted Mrs. Pemberley's somewhat constrained invitation with the mild gratitude of a woman who was always glad to have something interesting to observe. Mrs. Pemberley produced the key from her handbag, a small plain key upon an unremarkable ring, and unlocked the brass clasp of the box with the efficient assurance of a woman who always knew where her belongings were and expected them to remain there. The lid was lifted. The contents were tipped carefully onto the white tablecloth. There was not a great deal. A number of envelopes lay inside, some sealed and others merely folded over, each containing donations of varying amounts. There were also loose coins and 2 or 3 small notes that had been pushed directly through the slot without the mediating respectability of an envelope. Mrs. Pemberley arranged these into little categories with practiced fingers, making those small, quiet sounds of orderliness by which some women manage half their lives. Miss Trench took up a pencil and stood ready. The counting was conducted in silence, which gave the affair an air of solemnity somewhat beyond what the actual sums required. Miss Marple watched, not so much the money as the people. Mr. Whitton's eyes followed the coins as they were sorted, and in his expression she read a complicated mixture of resignation, irritation, and wounded honesty. He had said earlier that he disliked arithmetic, and Miss Marple believed him, not because he lacked intelligence, but because the restlessness visible in him now seemed less like fear than discomfort with a language not his own. He was a man who did not naturally inhabit the world of figures, and he had been forced into standing witness while figures determined whether his character survived the afternoon intact. Miss Trench verified each total in a neat hand, her pencil moving with the exactness of someone accustomed to ledgers and account books. She neither hurried nor embellished, yet there was in her careful impartiality a degree of effort that Miss Marple did not miss. Real neutrality tends to sit naturally upon a person. Performed neutrality nearly always conceals a position. At length, the count was completed. The deficit remained. There was no drama in the revelation. The numbers returned precisely what they had returned before, with that calm, indifferent finality arithmetic so often brings to human distress. The little group at the table received the result each in his or her own register of resignation. Mrs. Pemberley entered the final figure in her notebook with the air of a woman whose accuracy had been confirmed, which indeed it had, at least so far as the second count could confirm the first. Mr. Whitton exhaled through his nose. Miss Trench set down her pencil. "Well," said Mr. Whitton, after the brief silence that followed, "that is the same as before." "It is," said Mrs. Pemberley. Another silence succeeded the first, but this one was drier and carried more weight. Miss Marple turned slightly toward Mrs. Pemberley, with the gently interested expression she had long ago discovered to be one of the least alarming and most effective expressions in the world. "I wonder," she said, "whether I might ask how the contributions were first tallied this morning. Were they recorded as they came in, or counted together afterwards?" Mrs. Pemberley looked at her with the small, recalibrating expression of a woman who has been asked a question from a direction she had not expected to need guarding. "I recorded each contribution as it was brought to the table," she said. "The total in my notebook reflects what was received." "And the notebook is entirely in your own hand?" "It is. I keep my own records." "Of course," said Miss Marple warmly. "I only wondered because when a number of donations arrive in quick succession, one's figures may occasionally run a little ahead of the actual moment. At church sales, I have sometimes found it surprisingly easy to write down the amount one expects to receive before one has quite finished counting what is actually there. No fault in the person recording, you understand? Simply the mind moving a trifle faster than the fingers." This was received differently by each of the others present. Mr. Whitton looked at Miss Marple with a faint and rather moving expression of gratitude, as though at last someone had offered a possibility that did not involve his humiliation. Miss Trench looked at her more sharply than before, with a quick attention that suggested she had revised her estimate of Miss Marple upward. Mrs. Pemberley received the suggestion with impeccable civility, and a very distinct resistance just beneath it. "My records are accurate," she said. "I am sure they are," Miss Marple replied, without the least trace of contradiction. "I was thinking only of the possibility of an honest error, which is another matter entirely. Honest errors are so easily made, and even more easily missed by the person who makes them, precisely because there has been no intention behind them." Mr. Whitton said rather abruptly, "I dislike arithmetic. I said so this morning. Mrs. Pemberley knows perfectly well that I deferred to others where figures were concerned." As he spoke, he looked at Mrs. Pemberley, and in the look there was something not quite accusatory, for Mr. Whitton was not an accusing man by nature, but much nearer to accusation than anything he had yet permitted himself. Mrs. Pemberley met his eye steadily. "You were responsible for the box," she said. "I was responsible for keeping it safe," he answered. "And I have said repeatedly that I did so. If the amount in it was wrong before it came into my hands, that is not something I can fairly be blamed for." It was a more pointed response than any he had made so far, and the atmosphere at the trestle table shifted very slightly in consequence. Mrs. Pemberley looked at him for a moment, her expression difficult to read, and then turned away. Miss Trench became very interested in her pencil. "I understood," said Miss Marple conversationally, "that Miss Trench had also seen the contributions earlier, before luncheon. Was that so?" Miss Trench looked up at once. The colour returned to her cheeks, though this time it had a more definite quality. "I looked over the contributions as they came in," she said. "I was helping at the table for part of the morning. Mrs. Pemberley made the formal entries." "And did your general impression of the sum correspond with Mrs. Pemberley's recorded total?" There followed a pause of a kind that has shape and weight. "Broadly," said Miss Trench. Miss Marple nodded as though "broadly" were an entirely satisfactory answer, and perhaps the very one she had hoped for. "That is helpful," she said. She let her eyes rest for a moment on the open notebook lying on the tablecloth. The handwriting was very regular, small, upright, and carefully spaced. It was the hand of a person long accustomed to orderly entries, a hand practiced enough to look entirely unremarkable. There was nothing visibly hurried, nothing crooked, nothing outwardly suspicious. And yet Miss Marple had spent most of her life discovering that what mattered was seldom the obvious sign, not the trembling hand, not the averted gaze. Those things were too dramatic and often misled. What mattered was usually something smaller, a column a shade too neat, a phrase a little too ready, a figure written with just a touch more care than the others around it. She thanked Mrs. Pemberley for allowing her to observe the recount, and gathered her cardigan around her shoulders with the quiet deliberation of a woman preparing to return to her place. Then, as she rose, she paused. "One small question," she said, as though it had only just occurred to her. "The original record, the first sheet you used this morning, before the totals were copied into the notebook. You still have that, I suppose?" Mrs. Pemberley was silent for a moment. "I do not," she said at last. The first sheet became smudged. I transcribed the figures to a clean page. "Ah," said Miss Marple, with the gentle satisfaction of a woman who has just had something confirmed for her. "What a pity, though I am sure the figures were transferred exactly." "Of course," said Mrs. Pemberley. "Of course," said Miss Marple. She returned to her rug, her knitting, and the last warm comfort of the afternoon, carrying with her a great deal to consider. A record copied out for clarity after the original has disappeared is, she reflected, a record that asks to be accepted entirely on trust. And trust, in Miss Marple's experience, was most readily requested by those who understood that scrutiny would be much less obliging. The shadows of the elms had lengthened now, reaching almost to the river path. From the lower meadow came the faint crack of willow against leather and the small murmur of approval that village cricket produces. Not the roar of importance, but the contented sound of familiar entertainment proceeding as it always does. Miss Marple listened to it with pleasure. She thought about honest mistakes and very careful records. She thought about a figure entered in a neat notebook, and a first sheet that had somehow been smudged beyond use. She thought about a deficit that remained comfortingly consistent across 2 counts, and about a woman who had chosen to make her announcement before the lemonade, at the moment of fullest attention. And then she thought, very quietly, about Miss Adelaide Trench, who had offered the word broadly and had not chosen to improve upon it, and who had spent the entire afternoon standing with remarkable care somewhere between every available position. Yes, she thought, there were several more chapters yet in this story, and at least one of them would prove considerably more revealing than the arithmetic. Chapter 5. The Silver Brooch Against Blue Cloth. Tea was served at 4 o'clock, which Miss Marple had always considered one of the more civilized assurances that English life, despite all evidence to the contrary, still possessed some instincts worth preserving. Whatever disturbances the afternoon had introduced, they had not extended to the tea. It was hot, strong, and accompanied by a generous assembly of cakes and biscuits arranged upon folding tables with such care and abundance that one felt the parish of St. Mary Mead had approached refreshment in an admirable spirit of seriousness. Miss Marple accepted her cup from a young woman she did not immediately place. One of the Henderson nieces, she thought, visiting from somewhere north of Coventry, and carried it back across the grass with the careful, unhurried tread of a woman who had learned long ago that haste and hot tea are uneasy companions. The lower meadow had fallen quieter now. The cricket had ended in one of those inconclusive yet entirely satisfactory ways which allow both sides to feel they have acquitted themselves well without requiring the record books to become involved. The players had come back up the slope in twos and threes and were now engaged in retrospective discussion, which, as Miss Marple had often observed, was one of the chief pleasures of village cricket, and generally occupied about 4 times as much time as the match itself. The shadows of the elms had lengthened, soft and elegant upon the grass, and the quality of the light had changed into that golden, faintly melancholy register peculiar to late July afternoons, when they are being particularly beautiful. It was in this softened light that Miss Marple found herself once more observing Mrs. Clarice Norwood. Mrs. Norwood had placed herself on a low folding chair, just beyond the central activity of the tea tables, near enough to seem part of things, but not so near as to be caught in the middle of them. The position looked accidental, but Miss Marple doubted very much that it was. Mrs. Norwood held her cup in both hands and looked toward the river bend with the composed expression of a woman either content in her own company or long accustomed to having no particular alternative. The silver brooch was pinned to the lapel of her blue linen jacket. In the slanting light, it caught a small, sharp point of brightness, and it was this brightness, more than anything, which drew Miss Marple's attention back to it now with greater focus than her earlier passing glance had allowed. It was a handsome piece, old certainly, and belonging to that earlier part of the century when silverwork was often made with patient skill and without the vulgar necessity of announcing itself at once. The spray of forget-me-nots had been rendered with delicate exactness, each little flower distinct, the stems curving with a natural grace that suggested a craftsman who had understood flowers as well as metal. Miss Marple had seen brooches of that kind in drawing-rooms all her life. She knew them to be precisely the sort of object that gathers significance with the years and comes, in time, to represent considerably more than its market value. She did not approach Mrs. Norwood at once. There is always a right moment for such things, and it is very rarely the one a person chooses beforehand. Far more often, it is a moment that presents itself unexpectedly and must simply be recognized when it arrives. This one arrived in the person of the vicar's wife. Mrs. Alderton, who had the pleasant and useful gift of genuine sociability, settled herself beside Mrs. Norwood with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance, and immediately began speaking of the tea cake with heartfelt approval. Miss Marple gathered up her knitting and teacup and, by gradual and entirely natural degrees, drifted into the vicinity with all the purposeful aimlessness of a woman following the tide of afternoon conversation. Mrs. Alderton welcomed her with delight, and at once drew her into an earnest discussion of whether Mrs. Fenwick's lemon drizzle or Mrs. Norwood's shortbread represented the superior contribution to this year's tea table. Mrs. Norwood received the praise of her shortbread with the contained satisfaction of a woman who considered the judgment entirely just, while preferring not to appear to have expected it. For some minutes they spoke of agreeable things. The weather, which had vindicated those who had trusted it. The cricket, which had been well played, though the fielding in the second innings had apparently left room for criticism. And the condition of the elm trees, two of which were said to be giving concern to the churchwarden, and had, Mrs. Alderton informed them, already occupied more than one parish committee discussion. It was only when Mrs. Alderton was summoned away to settle a question regarding the packing of the remaining food, a matter which appeared by common consent to require her authority, and could not possibly wait, that Miss Marple allowed the conversation to turn, with the gentlest possible adjustment, toward the brooch. "What a very lovely piece," she said, in the straightforward tone of a woman noticing something she genuinely admired. "The workmanship is really exceptional. Is it a family piece?" Mrs. Norwood looked down at it. Her expression was not quite what such a compliment usually produces. There was no immediate glow of pleasure. Instead, something more complicated passed over her face, something brief and inward, like a small cloud crossing over water, before the surface of composure settled again. "It was left to me," she said, "by an elderly friend." "How fortunate," said Miss Marple warmly. "The things with history attached to them are always the most interesting. One wears them differently, I think, from those that are merely bought." "Yes," said Mrs. Norwood. Then, after a pause that seemed to carry rather more weight than the word alone required, she added, "I was very fond of her." Miss Marple inclined her head and let a respectful silence rest between them for a little while. Then, as though the notion had only just occurred to her, she said mildly, "I noticed Mrs. Pemberley looked at it rather particularly earlier. I wondered whether she recognized it." This time the pause altered in quality. Mrs. Norwood's hands, which had lain quietly in her lap, moved very slightly, then became still again. "It is possible that she did," she said. "I thought there might perhaps be some connection," said Miss Marple, in the innocent tone of conversational curiosity. "Villages are full of such things. One discovers that an object has passed through several households over the years, and each of them leaves something of itself upon the story." Mrs. Norwood considered this. She was, Miss Marple had already noted, a woman who thought before speaking, which is always admirable, and is, on occasion, extremely useful. "The friend who left it to me," Mrs. Norwood said at last, "was Miss Evelyn Pemberley, Harriet Pemberley's mother." Miss Marple received this with mild interest that was not, in fact, wholly feigned. She had suspected a connection as soon as she had seen the intensity of Mrs. Pemberley's earlier glance at the brooch, but she had not known exactly what form it took. "I see," she said simply. "Evelyn and I were close for many years," Mrs. Norwood continued, with the care of a woman deciding how much of an old story she is willing to reopen. "We met through the church embroidery circle long ago. She was a very private woman, in the way so many of her generation were private, but she was warm once she had admitted a person. When she died, she left the brooch to me directly in her will." "And Mrs. Pemberley," said Miss Marple gently, "was not pleased." "Not pleased," said Mrs. Norwood, is one way of describing it. The brevity of the answer contained a great deal. She looked down at the brooch again, and there was in her face now neither apology nor defiance, but something more settled, a calm that suggested she had long ago reached her own conclusions on the subject and did not intend to revisit them for anyone's comfort. Harriet believed it ought to have come to her as the daughter, she said. I understood her feeling. Evelyn's reasons were her own. She kept them to herself, which was her right. It must have been awkward, said Miss Marple, and meant it. She understood, as she always had, that the objects people quarrel over are seldom truly about the objects themselves. It was awkward, said Mrs. Norwood. We have managed. We have served on the same committee for 6 years and managed perfectly well. But there is a great difference between managing and being easy. Miss Marple let her eyes rest for a moment on the little silver flowers. You chose to wear it today, she observed, without emphasis. There was a very small pause. I wear it often, said Mrs. Norwood. Of course, said Miss Marple. She drank her tea and considered all she had heard with the quiet inward satisfaction she always took in a fact that possessed depth. The difficulty between the two women, then, was not of this afternoon's making. It was older than the donation box, older than the public accusation, older than the shortage itself. It had roots, and those roots ran down through years of maintained civility into something far less comfortable. An old wound, never fully healed, and periodically touched raw by the sight of a silver brooch against blue linen. A woman who had nourished a grievance for 6 years, Miss Marple reflected, does not readily detach it from the people and occasions to which it has become attached. She had seen such things repeatedly, in drawing rooms, church halls, committee meetings, and village fêtes. The old resentment waits. It is patient. It does not need to speak every day. It requires only a suitable opportunity, a missing sum, an unsecured box, a question of responsibility, and then it fastens itself eagerly upon the occasion and says, at last, what it has wanted to say all along. The real question, Miss Marple thought, as she turned her cup slowly in her hands, was not whether there had been a grievance. That was now perfectly plain. The question was whether the grievance had merely provided the opportunity for accusation, or whether it had provided something further, a motive that did not simply trail backward into old injury, but reached forward into present design. That was a different matter altogether. Across the tea tables, Mrs. Pemberley was speaking to the churchwarden with every appearance of restored efficiency. Her notebook closed and returned to her handbag, her dark blue poplin as orderly as ever. She did not look once toward Mrs. Norwood. In fact, Miss Marple realized, she had not looked at her at all since the recount. Mrs. Norwood, for her part, had resumed her composed contemplation of the middle distance, her cup steady in her hands, the brooch catching and releasing its little point of light. Between the two women there seemed to run something old, invisible, and taut as thread, something far older than the parish picnic, older than the donation box, perhaps nearly as old as several of the elms now under committee scrutiny. Mrs. Marple could not yet see the whole shape of it, but she could feel the tension, and that, in her experience, was a very good beginning. She finished her tea and thanked Mrs. Norwood for the conversation, which she said, quite truthfully, she had found most interesting. Mrs. Norwood looked at her then with the same keen, evaluating expression Miss Marple had seen before, but this time there was rather more warmth in it. You are a very observant woman, Miss Marple, she said. I am a very idle one, Miss Marple replied pleasantly. Idleness, I have always thought, is simply observation that has found the proper pace. She gathered her knitting and cardigan and moved back across the grass. And if, on her way, she paused once to glance at the trestle table and once toward Mrs. Pemberley, she did so with the mild indirection of a woman returning to her rug by no particular route at all. No one watching her would have been able to say what she was thinking, which was, in the end, exactly as she preferred. Chapter 6. A list penned in neat handwriting. The donor list made its appearance at approximately 4:20, produced by Miss Adelaide Trench, with the slightly constrained air of a person who has been carrying a folded paper in her pocket for rather longer than comfort permits, and has finally decided that either the moment for producing it has arrived, or else that delay has become impossible. The fact that she brought it to Miss Marple was in itself interesting. This was not one of those casual proximities out of which afternoon conversation arises. Nothing so accidental as two ladies finding themselves simultaneously before the same plate of biscuits. It was a deliberate approach, accomplished by a brisk and purposeful walk, the walk of a woman who has reached a decision and is carrying it out before she has time to reconsider. She came directly to Miss Marple's rug, glanced once around the immediate space to assure herself she would not be overheard, and then lowered herself onto one corner of the rug with the practical abruptness of someone who has decided that social preliminaries would only consume time she cannot spare. "I have been thinking," said Miss Trench without preamble, "that there is something you ought to see." From the inner pocket of her light summer jacket, she withdrew a folded sheet of paper. It was not new. The paper had softened slightly at the creases. In that way documents do, when they have been handled more than once over the course of a day. Miss Trench unfolded it with care, suggesting that she attached importance not merely to the paper itself, but to what it might now require of her. It was the donor list, not Mrs. Pemberley's neat notebook, which still remained in Mrs. Pemberley's handbag, but a separate working sheet, the practical record Miss Trench had kept independently during the morning while assisting at the contribution table in her role as treasurer's assistant. She entered each donation with the donor's name and the amount given, in a row of neat dark entries down the page. Miss Marple accepted it and examined it without haste. The handwriting was regular and clear, the hand of a trained teacher accustomed to letters that must be legible at a distance. Each entry was marked with a time, an excellent habit, Miss Marple thought, and at once a significant one. The list ran from 9 o'clock until a little after 11, which corresponded to the period during which Miss Trench had said she was helping at the table. There were 14 names in all. Miss Marple read the sheet through once, then again, and then looked up at Miss Trench with mild inquiry and no visible conclusion. "You will notice," said Miss Trench, in the carefully controlled tone of someone who has rehearsed the sentence inwardly, that several of the names correspond to donations entered in Mrs. Pemberley's notebook, but the amounts are not the same. "I see, said Miss Marple. "Two of them," Miss Trench continued, "are lower in Mrs. Pemberley's record than they are in mine, not by large amounts, but in both cases the difference is on the same side, and together they move toward the deficit." Miss Marple lowered her eyes to the list once more. "You have compared the two records?" "During the recount," said Miss Trench. "Mrs. Pemberley had her notebook open on the table. I had my own list in my pocket. I looked while I could." She paused. "I did not say anything at the time. I was not certain. And it did not seem the right moment." "No," said Miss Marple, in a tone that indicated she understood very well why it had not been the right moment, and was reserving judgment on whether the present one was much better. The two disputed entries had been marked with small pencil crosses, clearly added later. The pencil was fresher than the ink. The discrepancies were modest, small enough that either one, standing alone, might have passed unnoticed. It was only in comparison that they acquired meaning, and only to a person already alert to pattern. "When you said broadly," said Miss Marple, "during the recount, you meant this." Miss Trench looked at her with a faint start, as though she had not expected to be understood with quite that degree of accuracy. "Yes," she said. "I did not know how to put it. I did not want to make an accusation I could not fully support. I have only my notes. Mrs. Pemberley has the notebook." "And you keep such notes routinely?" "Always," said Miss Trench. "Whenever I assist at collections. It is simply my method. I like there to be a second check." She said this with a slight defensiveness, as though half expecting the practice to be judged excessive. Miss Marple, who thought it entirely sensible, said nothing to suggest otherwise. "Several of these entries," Miss Marple observed, studying the page, "are in a very similar hand. These 3, for instance, between 10 and 10:05. Miss Trench nodded at once. Mrs. Alderton brought those in together. She had collected them from the families arriving through the lower gate. I wrote them down quickly, one after the other. That is why the script scarcely changes." It was a straightforward answer, and Miss Marple accepted it. She had not, in truth, raised the point from suspicion of Miss Trench's record. The similarity of the writing had drawn her attention instead to the narrow spacing between the entries and the time marks beside them. They had the compressed irregularity of notes made in the moment and at speed, not reconstructed later from recollection. That mattered. Miss Trench's sheet had the proper look of an honest working document, slightly crowded, practical, immediate. Mrs. Pemberley's notebook, by contrast, had possessed the settled tidiness of a fair copy. Miss Marple folded the list gently along its existing creases and held it for a moment before giving it back. "When records are rewritten neatly," she said almost as though to herself, "original figures sometimes need to be adjusted to accommodate what one wishes the total to become." Miss Trench looked at her sharply. "I have not been able to make myself think it through to the end," she said with sudden frankness. "It is a very serious thing to suggest." "It is indeed," said Miss Marple, "and I have not suggested it. I have only observed that 2 careful records, made by 2 careful women at the same table on the same morning, do not agree. That is a fact. What the fact may mean is another matter, and not one to be decided before it has been better examined." Miss Trench sat silent for a moment. All around them, the afternoon had begun to thin toward its close. The picnic was entering that final phase inevitable to all such occasions. Hampers being repacked, rugs shaken out, children retrieved from river paths with mixed success, and lingering, groups of adults sustaining one last pocket of conversation before conceding the day. A few small companies still remained in the upper meadow, unwilling to abandon so pleasant an afternoon altogether, but the general current had begun to move toward the gate. "I should not have kept it to myself so long," said Miss Trench at last. "You kept it," said Miss Marple, "until you found a way of doing something sensible with it. That is a very different thing." She said this not as comfort, but as correction. Miss Trench looked at her, and though the expression was not quite relief, it was certainly near it. "I did not know what to do with it alone," she said, "and I am still not wholly certain that what I think I see in the figures is actually there." "That uncertainty," said Miss Marple, "is the mark of a careful mind. Complete certainty is very often the first thing lost when a person begins to think accurately. That appeared to reassure Miss Trench more than she had anticipated. She folded the list and returned it to her pocket with the unmistakable air of a woman who has at last handed part of a burden to someone else and finds the redistribution of weight a genuine relief. She thanked Miss Marple, rose, and went back toward the committee table with a briskness that had more real energy in it than anything she had displayed since the morning. Miss Marple remained where she was for some time after she had gone, knitting very little. She was thinking about Mrs. Pemberley's notebook, the upright little figures, the almost architectural neatness of the columns, and about the original sheet that had been smudged beyond usefulness and recopied for clarity. Clarity achieved at the cost of the original, a record that could now be tested against nothing but itself. And then she thought of Miss Trench's working list, with its honest compressions, its haste, its slight irregularities, its 2 penciled crosses resting quietly beside the entries that did not match. Clarity, Miss Marple reflected, was an excellent thing. It was also, on occasion, a most convenient one. Chapter 7. Laughter cut off too early. The cricket match, as village cricket matches in England are prone to do, had given rise to a secondary discussion, which was, by several measurements, rather more absorbing than the match itself. This discussion concerned a particular ball in the 4th, over which had been called a wide by the umpire, a retired schoolmaster of substantial dignity and less than perfect eyesight, and which a considerable portion of the batting side maintained had in fact been a masterpiece of legitimate spin, cruelly and ignorantly misjudged. Every sign suggested that the argument would continue for at least another week, and possibly much longer. Miss Marple had not herself seen the disputed delivery. At the time of its occurrence, she had been some distance away, occupied with a donor list and a conscientious schoolteacher. She had, however, excellent access to the retelling of the event, which came to her from 3 separate gentlemen in succession, each entirely confident in his account, and each contradicting the others in all points of practical significance. She found this extremely interesting, though not particularly in connection with the cricket. It was while Mr. Whitton was giving her the 3rd, and by far the most elaborate, version of the matter that Miss Marple began, by easy degrees, to ask him about the earlier part of the afternoon. Mr. Gerald Whitton was not, in ordinary life, a man to whom conversation presented any special strain. He spoke on most subjects with the comfortable openness of a person not greatly burdened by rigid opinions, and therefore not much inclined to guard them. But the moment the topic drifted back toward the donation box and its movements throughout the day, something in him altered. Not evasively. Evasion would have required a greater degree of calculation than was natural to Mr. Whitton, but carefully, in the manner of someone who has already endured one public embarrassment and is anxious not to offer the village a second. "I have been thinking," said Miss Marple in the mild tone of one making a remark about the afternoon arrangements, "about the movement of the box during the cricket. You said it was shifted to avoid any stray balls. Was that your own idea or someone else's?" Mr. Whitton considered. "There was a general suggestion," he said. "The match was beginning, and someone, I think it may have been young Henderson, pointed out that anything driven toward the north boundary might come unpleasantly near the trestle table. So there was a bit of rearranging, and the donation box was moved to the lemonade table." "And you moved it?" "I did," said Mr. Whitton, with a slight but very definite emphasis. "I carried it there myself and put it at the far end of the lemonade table, well clear of any likely line of play. I stayed near it for some little time, and later, Well, later I drifted somewhat down the slope. The cricket was, for a few overs at least, rather good, and I found myself farther from the table than I had intended. He paused. I was not away long. A quarter of an hour, perhaps. And during that quarter of an hour, said Miss Marple gently, you were watching the match? Yes. And the lemonade table was behind you? Mr. Whitten looked at her with the mild discomfort of a man who sees where a question is going before it has entirely arrived. I suppose it was, he said. I was facing the pitch. One cannot very well watch cricket and a lemonade table at the same moment. No, said Miss Marple sympathetically. One never can. A little silence followed, during which Mr. Whitten seemed privately to review the implications of this, and to find them less agreeable than he might have wished. I suppose, he said at last slowly, that the box may have been unattended for some part of that time. It may indeed, said Miss Marple, with the equanimity of a person merely confirming what has already more or less established itself. Tell me, did you notice Mrs. Pemberley at any point during the cricket? I mean where she was standing? Mr. Whitten thought. The thinking was genuine. Miss Marple could see that plainly enough. He was not manufacturing recollection, but searching for it honestly, which produces in people quite a different expression. She was near the lemonade table early on, he said. I remember that because I had only just moved the box there, and was still rather aware of it. She was pouring lemonade, I think, or standing by the table at any rate. And later, she had gone at some point. He frowned slightly, following the memory. Yes, I recall noticing it because there was rather a good moment. Alderton's boy hit a six, and I turned to say something to whoever was nearest, and Mrs. Pemberley was no longer there. He paused once more. The laughter had just begun over the six, and then she simply was not beside the table any longer. I thought nothing of it at the time, of course. People move about. There is no reason anyone should remain planted in one place. Of course not, said Miss Marple. The laughter over the six, she repeated softly, almost to herself, as though fitting the detail into some inward arrangement. There had been, she thought, something rather important in that moment, or more precisely in the discovery of it. Laughter is one of the great disguises of social life. When a group laughs together, it fixes its collective attention upon one thing and one thing only. For those few seconds, nobody is observing anything else at all. A person who understood this, and some people do understand such things instinctively, might carry out a small but decisive action in that brief interval and be seen by nobody. She thanked Mr. Whitten for his account, which she described as most helpful. He went away looking rather uncertain whether it had been helpful in a direction likely to improve his own comfort. Miss Marple remained still, considering the matter of the laughter and what it might have concealed. It was while doing so that she became aware, by that peripheral sensitivity long habit had trained in her, that a conversation was taking place some 20 feet to her left, which possessed the very particular quality of suppressed importance. It was not loud enough to attract a casual ear, but it had that low intensity which suggests two people are not quite quarrelling, and yet are certainly not exchanging ordinary pleasantries. The speakers were Mrs. Pemberley and Mrs. Norwood. They stood at the edge of the elm shade, facing one another, not directly, but at a slight angle. The posture adults in villages tend to adopt when they are saying something they do not wish to be observed saying. Whatever passed between them had the unmistakable air of matter long postponed, and now, under pressure, insisting upon expression. Miss Marple did not move closer. There was no need. She had spent many years learning to read a conversation by its rhythm its stillness, the distribution of silence within it, even when the words themselves could not be heard. And what she read now was plain enough in outline. Mrs. Norwood was speaking in that contained and level way which suggests not persuasion, but statement. Mrs. Pemberley was listening with the rigid stillness of a person to whom the statement is unwelcome. There came a brief exchange in which both spoke at once, or almost at once, and then Mrs. Norwood made one final remark, short, definitive, and turned away toward the lower gate with the calm and unhurried tread of a woman who has said what she intended to say and requires nothing further from the place in which she has said it. Mrs. Pemberley remained where she was for another moment. Her composure, maintained throughout the day with notable skill, showed then the faintest line of strain, not enough for the casual observer to identify as distress, but quite enough for Miss Marple, who was not casual. It was the look of someone who has just been told something true and finds the truth inconvenient. Then Mrs. Pemberley straightened her jacket, lifted her chin by a small but distinct degree, and went back toward the committee table. Miss Marple returned to her knitting with the quiet inward air of a woman who has just reached a chapter in a book she had been waiting for. The afternoon was drawing to its close now. The meadow had already begun to take on that softened and slightly diminished look a room acquires after a party, the furniture still in place, the decorations still cheerful, but the particular animation lent by people already beginning to withdraw. Hampers were being lifted. Children were being retrieved. The churchwarden was counting chairs with the resigned precision of a man who has done so many times before and fully expects to do so again. Miss Marple packed her things gradually, as was her habit. The knitting went away first, then the cardigan, then the small bag of necessities and miscellaneous items which accompanied her everywhere and whose exact contents she had not audited in years. She thought about laughter and what it covers. She thought about a quarter of an hour during which a man who disliked arithmetic had stood with his back to a table while watching cricket. She thought about a brief walk from the elm shade to the lower gate, taken with the composed assurance of a woman who had settled something. She thought about Mrs. Pemberley's face in the shadow of the tree and that slight, unmistakable fracture in its surface. And she thought of something she had once read, or perhaps heard, she could no longer remember which, to the effect that performed indignation has a texture quite different from the real thing. Genuine indignation stumbles upon itself. It discovers its grievance in the moment. Performed indignation arrives complete, already shaped, already supplied with evidence, already conscious of its audience. Mrs. Pemberley's indignation, Miss Marple had suspected since earlier in the afternoon, had not been spontaneous. She was now rather more certain of it. What remained was not merely to know what had been done, nor even how, but why it had become suddenly necessary to do it now. Why this afternoon, this picnic, this particular year, when 5 previous years of the same silver brooch, pinned to the same blue linen, had been endured in managed silence. Something had changed recently. Something had created urgency in a woman ordinarily capable of excellent self-command. Miss Marple opened her cream and green sunshade against the lowering light, settled her bag more securely on her arm, and prepared to make her way toward the gate. She had almost all of it now. There was only one piece, still missing, and she had very little doubt that it would present itself soon enough. Such things generally did, if one gave them sufficient time and sufficient attention. The laughter that had begun over the 6 had stopped too soon, she reflected, because by the time it ended, Mrs. Pemberley was no longer standing where she had been, and in that absence, something had been done. Whether it had been done from resentment, from necessity, or from some combination of both. That was the question for the morning. Chapter 8. The donation box kept under lock. The morning after the parish picnic was a Sunday, which gave it a quality of stillness no ordinary weekday can quite manage. St. Mary Mead, on a Sunday morning in late July, possessed that settled, unhurried rhythm, which Miss Marple had always found deeply reassuring. Church bells at 9, a gradual and decorous movement toward the 11 o'clock service, gardens receiving the sort of careful attention that weekdays rarely permit, and, over everything, the sense of a community proceeding in its proper order. This morning, however, Miss Marple found the effect not merely reassuring, but useful. She had slept, as she often did, after a day of considerable mental activity, with the complete and healthy thoroughness of a woman wise enough to let her thoughts settle themselves undisturbed. She woke at 7 with that agreeable inward clarity which comes when one's mind has spent the night putting things into their proper compartments. By 8 o'clock she had taken her tea, fed the garden birds, and formed a very definite intention concerning the donation box. The box, she knew, had been taken to the vicarage. She knew this because the previous evening, in passing through the lower gate, she had paused to ask the church warden in the incidental tone she used when seeking a fact without advertising the search, what arrangements had been made for the box after the afternoon's unhappy developments. Mr. Parsons, a dependable man who had managed parish property for 22 years and regarded its security as a matter second only to salvation, had informed her that he had taken the box himself for safekeeping and left it at the vicarage until the committee should determine what was to be done next. Miss Marple presented herself at the vicarage at 9 o'clock. The Reverend Alderton answered the door himself, a gentle, slightly rumpled man, with the mild and respectful perplexity clergymen often reserve for Miss Marple. She had telephoned ahead, so he expressed no surprise at her visit, and ushered her into the study with every appearance of hospitality. The study smelled of books, cold pipe tobacco, and that indefinable vicarage atmosphere which appears in such rooms throughout England regardless of the character or habits of the clergyman who inhabits them. The donation box stood on the writing desk, where Mr. Parsons had left it. In the quiet of the study, it seemed smaller than it had on the trestle table in open air, a plain dark green wooden box, perhaps 9 inches long, with brass fittings rubbed slightly thin at the corners by years of annual use. The slot for the money was cut near the top of the front panel. The lock was simple, a small barrel lock of the ordinary sort, requiring a key easily duplicated by any competent locksmith, and, Miss Marple thought, by several incompetent ones as well. She asked the vicar whether she might examine it, explaining that she had a practical question regarding the mechanism which might bear upon the events of the previous afternoon. The Reverend Alderton, who had already been told by Mr. Parsons where the key was kept, produced it at once from the desk drawer with the obliging competence of a man determined that hospitality shall not suffer merely because he is not entirely sure what he is facilitating. Miss Marple lifted the box into the morning light from the window and turned it slowly in her hands. The dark green paint remained sound along most of the surface, except for the upper corners where frequent handling had produced faint scuffing. The brass slot was clean. The fittings at the corners were not merely ornamental, but served to protect the joins where seasonal use had worn them over time. Then there was the lock. She had noticed it briefly during the recount. She had returned to it in memory more than once since. It had been one of those small details that ask persistently for fuller attention until they receive it. Now, In the stillness of the vicarage study, with Sunday peace lying outside the window and the vicar waiting politely nearby, she gave it exactly the attention it had been requesting. The scratches were very faint. They would have escaped notice altogether in the open air of the previous afternoon, with the light overhead and the observers standing at a distance. But here, held at just the right angle to the window, they showed themselves clearly enough. They were not the marks of force. There was nothing hurried or violent about them. They were the marks left by a key that fitted almost, but not perfectly. The sort of scratches made when a near duplicate is inserted repeatedly into a lock, close enough to work, but not exact enough to leave the metal untouched. A duplicate key, Miss Marple thought. Mrs. Pemberley had mentioned such a key. At the recount, she had opened the box herself and had referred to her key as a duplicate retained for emergencies. Miss Marple looked more closely. The scratches were not those made by the original key now in her hand, the committee key which Mr. Parsons kept. They came from another key, inserted from a slightly different angle, and from the direction and placement of the deeper marks, the box had been lying flat when that key was used, not upright as it would have been if held in the hands. Flat on a table. The lemonade table, Miss Marple thought, had stood at about waist height. A person opening the box there would naturally set it down and work from above. The angle matched. She put the box back on the desk and sat down in the vicar's chair, which he had offered her, looking at the object with the settled calm of a woman whose final loose thread has just slipped neatly into place. A very ordinary thing, she said with mild warmth. It has served the parish faithfully for many years, said the Reverend Alderton from the doorway. He had the expression of a man who did not entirely know what was happening, but possessed sufficient pastoral intelligence to allow it to go on uninterrupted. Ordinary objects, said Miss Marple, are often the most trustworthy witnesses. They do not revise their accounts, and they have no motive to protect anyone. The Reverend Alderton considered this with the serious courtesy clergymen bring to remarks that may be either practical or philosophical. I believe that is very true, he said, and meant it in both senses. Miss Marple asked whether Mrs. Pemberley had been in contact with the vicarage that morning. The vicar said that she had telephoned shortly after 8 to ask what arrangements had been made for the box and whether any official steps were likely to be taken before the following committee meeting. He had told her that Mr. Parsons had matters in hand and that he hoped the unpleasantness might be resolved amicably. Resolved amicably, repeated Miss Marple, in a reflective tone. Did she seem, how shall I put it, comfortable with that prospect? The Reverend Alderton hesitated with the conscientious difficulty of a man trying to balance charity with accuracy. She seemed, he said at last, rather more anxious than the word amicably would have suggested. Yes, said Miss Marple, I thought she might. She rose, thanked him sincerely for his kindness, and moved toward the door. Then, as he was showing her into the hall, she asked one final question. The duplicate key Mrs. Pemberley uses, was it formally issued by the committee, do you know? Or had it perhaps been made privately at some point? The Reverend Alderton considered this. I cannot say for certain, he replied. The box has been in use for many years, and the arrangements concerning keys were made before my time here. I know that Mr. Parsons keeps the committee key. Whether any other copies exist officially, I have no record of. I see, said Miss Marple. That is very helpful. She walked home through the Sunday morning of St. Mary Mead, which continued about its business with the calm authority of a village that does not alter its habits merely because something disagreeable has occurred. The earlier congregation was just beginning to emerge through the lich gate in those small, companionable groups of people not yet ready to separate after sharing an hour together. An elderly dog was investigating the churchyard wall with serious but declining energy. Somewhere near at hand, someone was mowing grass, which Miss Marple considered entirely appropriate to a July Sunday. She thought about the scratches on the lock. She thought about safety as a form of control, a phrase she had used the previous afternoon almost instinctively when speaking to Mrs. Pembley about the duplicate key. At the time, she had not yet seen the physical evidence. She had merely followed another thread. It was one of the quiet satisfactions of detection, she reflected, when a phrase arrived ahead of its proof, and the proof subsequently appeared to justify it. The duplicate key had opened the box. That, she thought, was established, not by force but by care, not by panic but by planning. The box had been opened at the lemonade table during that brief interval concealed by cricket, distance and laughter. The sum within had been reduced. The original record had then been destroyed, or more precisely, rendered unavailable, and a clean copy produced in which 2 figures were altered, downward to accommodate the missing amount. The whole was then presented as a transcription made for clarity, and then, before the lemonade had even been properly poured, the accusation had been made, at exactly the earliest point when the audience was complete and attentive, directing suspicion first toward Mr. Whitton, and, by implication and proximity, toward Mrs. Norwood. Safety as control, clarity as concealment. There still remained the question that had occupied her since the previous evening. Why now? Why this year, this afternoon, when 5 earlier summers had passed with the same brooch fastened to the same blue linen, and no such drama had been attempted? Something had altered recently. Something had introduced urgency, enough urgency not only to take money and adjust figures, but to construct blame around the absence of both. She did not yet have the complete answer to that question, but she was, she thought, very near it. The Sunday morning settled gently around her as she walked, and the village resumed its old familiar rhythm, and Miss Marple allowed herself the modest inward satisfaction of a woman who has examined a locked box and discovered that it has, in the end, told her everything she needed to know. Chapter 9. What took place after the cricket match? The vicarage drawing room at 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon possessed the unmistakable atmosphere of a room prepared for a difficult conversation, and making a sincere effort not to advertise the fact. The chairs had been arranged with slightly more care than usual. The afternoon light entered at an angle kind enough not to expose people too harshly, but not so soft as to flatter them into complacency. A pot of tea had been provided, and then Reverend Alderton had withdrawn to his study with the tact of a man who understood that on certain occasions his most valuable contribution was complete and courteous absence. It was Miss Marple who had asked for the gathering. She had done so that morning, after leaving the vicarage and examining the donation box, by means of 3 carefully phrased telephone calls, one to Mrs. Pembley, one to Mr. Whitton, and one to Miss Trench. To each she had said only that there was a matter of some importance which she believed it would be in everyone's interest to settle quietly and before the week's committee meeting. She had not telephoned Mrs. Norwood. Mrs. Norwood arrived nevertheless, having been informed by Miss Trench, exactly as Miss Marple had expected she would. They came within minutes of one another. Mr. Whitton was the first to arrive, carrying the anxious, faintly hopeful look of a man who has been told that better news may be forthcoming, but does not yet feel safe enough to trust it. Mrs. Norwood came next, composed as ever and wearing a different brooch, a simple oval of polished jet, which Miss Marple noticed without comment. Miss Trench followed, her summer jacket over one arm and her expression that of a woman who has decided to be steady and means to remain so at any cost. Mrs. Pemberley came last, which was in itself unusual for a woman whose punctuality was generally one of her smaller moral principles. She entered with the bearing of someone who had spent considerable effort preserving composure and was beginning by mid-afternoon to find the effort somewhat expensive. They sat. Tea was poured. The room settled into that particular stillness created by four people, each waiting to discover what, precisely, is about to be said. Miss Marple placed her cup upon its saucer. "I am going to speak plainly," she said, in the pleasantly matter-of-fact tone she reserved for statements that required clarity rather than drama. "I believe I understand what happened at the picnic yesterday, and I think it would be better for everyone if the matter was set out directly, so that it may be resolved without any further unpleasantness." Mrs. Pemberley's folded hands made one small movement in her lap and then became still. "The money was not stolen," Miss Marple continued. "It was removed from the donation box and was then not returned in full. The box was opened during the cricket match. At the time, young Alderton hit his six, when the laughter of the company created a brief and effective cover. It was opened at the lemonade table with a duplicate key, while Mr. Whitten's attention was on the match, and the table itself was, for those few moments, unobserved." Mr. Whitten did not move, but something in his face altered. Less confusion now, and more the cautious stillness of a man listening to his own vindication, but not yet ready to claim it. "The amount removed," said Miss Marple, "was modest. I think it was not meant to remain missing for long. It was intended, I believe, to be replaced before anyone examined the accounts closely. That replacement did not occur." She paused. "This morning I examined the lock of the donation box. It bears marks consistent, not with the original committee key, but with a duplicate key, one sufficiently close to function, but not exact enough to leave no trace." Then she looked at Mrs. Pemberley. Her gaze was direct but unhurried, without triumph and without cruelty. Miss Marple had no taste for either. "When the deficit was discovered, or rather, when it became necessary to acknowledge the deficit, because its existence was already known, an accusation was then made, publicly. It was phrased with enough care to avoid a direct charge, but not with enough care to prevent an implication. The implication was meant to settle upon Mr. Whitten, and by extension, given the placement of the box and hamper near Mrs. Norwood. The silence that followed was complete. It was not, Miss Marple thought, a hostile silence. It was the silence of people hearing aloud something that several of them had already, in different ways, partly understood, and that one of them had been carrying alone for longer than she had wished. The notebook, Miss Marple said, was not the original working record. It was a rewritten version, prepared on the grounds that the first sheet had become smudged. Miss Trench's independent donor list contains two modest discrepancies from that revised record. Both discrepancies operate in the same direction. Both support the amount of the apparent deficit. Miss Trench lowered her eyes briefly, not in shame, but in that reflex of careful people who do not enjoy being right in difficult matters. Miss Marple spoke again, and this time her voice altered slightly. There was in it something gentler than accusation and more useful than absolution. "I believe," she said, "that there was a private necessity, a debt, perhaps, or an obligation that could not be postponed, something recent enough to create urgency. And I believe the accusation was not made merely to conceal the removal of the money, but to settle, under the shelter of that concealment, something older, a grievance that had been waiting some time for expression. The little clock on the mantel made its discreet domestic sound. Outside, Sunday afternoon continued in complete innocence. Mrs. Pembley remained still for a moment longer. Her composure held, but not with quite the same authority as before. It was, Miss Marple thought, a very durable composure, the product of long habit and long discipline, but one could now see that somewhere within it something had given way. Then Mrs. Pembley said, very quietly, "My brother." The words emerged with the strange lightness things sometimes acquire after they have been carried too long in silence. "He has debts," she said. "He has had them for years. I have managed them before, quietly, at intervals, without allowing them to become public. But there was a recent demand, more pressing than the others, from someone not prepared to wait." She stopped. "I needed money before the end of the month. Not an enormous sum, perhaps, but considerably more than I had available at once. And the roof fund," said Miss Marple softly, "was accessible." "Yes." Mrs. Pembley drew in a breath that did not quite steady her. "I intended to replace it within the week, before anyone examined the figures too closely. I have managed accounts before, on smaller occasions. It has never attracted notice." Miss Marple did not pursue that line. It was there, certainly, but it could wait, if it needed to exist at all. "And Mrs. Norwood?" she asked instead. For the first time since entering the room, Mrs. Pembley looked directly at Mrs. Norwood. It was a complicated look. There was in it the old wound, the brooch, the will, the daughter's hurt at finding something treasured had been given elsewhere. But there was also something more recent in it now, something less rehearsed, and perhaps, if faced honestly, less permanent. "I thought," said Mrs. Pembley slowly, "that if suspicion settled near her hamper, if there was talk of opportunity, of proximity, it would be believed." She closed her eyes for the briefest moment. "I knew it was unjust. I told myself it was temporary, that the money would be restored, and the matter would pass, and no real harm would be done." "But it did not pass," said Miss Marple. "No," said Mrs. Pembley, "it did not." Mrs. Norwood had listened without interruption, seated in that careful stillness of a woman determined not to offer any expression that might be misread. Now she turned her face fully toward Mrs. Pembley. What was in her expression was not anger. Anger would have been simpler. There was recognition in it, Miss Marple thought, and weariness, and perhaps the first faint outline of something that might, under the right conditions, become mercy. "I knew the brooch mattered to you," said Mrs. Norwood at last. "I have known it every time I wore it." "Then why?" said Mr. Whitton suddenly, with the plain directness of a man who had been publicly humiliated for 24 hours and had run out of patience with subtlety. Mrs. Norwood turned toward him. "Because Evelyn left it to me," she said. "Because she wished me to have it, and because I was fond of her." She paused. "I do not apologize for receiving what was given freely, but I am sorry that it has stood between us for so long." It was not a full reconciliation. Miss Marple knew better than to expect those all at once. But it was, she thought, an opening toward one, and openings are usually far more durable than performances. She turned to Miss Trench. "Miss Trench," she said, "has acted with exemplary conscientiousness. Her records were accurate, and her instinct in bringing them forward was quite right. even if delayed by a very understandable caution. Miss Trench coloured slightly and looked, for the first time since entering the room, almost relieved. "The money," Miss Marple continued, addressing Mrs. Pemberley again, "must be restored to the fund. I think you have known that since yesterday afternoon." "Yes," said Mrs. Pemberley, "it will be." "And Mr. Whitten's name should be cleared plainly and without ambiguity before the committee meets." "Yes," she said again. This time she looked at Mr. Whitten with an expression in which the apology had not yet found words, but had at least found sincerity. Mr. Whitten, being by nature a kindly man, appeared willing to accept the sincerity and wait a little while for the words to catch up with it. The light had shifted while they talked, and the drawing-room now glowed with the amber warmth of a late summer Sunday. Through the window, one could see Reverend Alderton's garden lying green and undisturbed, entirely innocent of accusation, arithmetic, and human weakness. Miss Marple poured herself a second cup of tea. She looked around the room with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has not exactly solved a puzzle. Puzzles are mechanical things, and people never are, but has at least brought a difficult arrangement into some working order. None of them, she thought, would speak of this meeting publicly. Villages possess a remarkable capacity for collective discretion when the alternative is a spectacle from which nobody would benefit. And the people now seated in this room were all, in their different ways, village people. They would manage the matter as villages often manage such matters, not perfectly, not dramatically, but with a practical preference for resolution over punishment. Miss Marple had always thought that one of the least admired forms of wisdom available in ordinary life. "Well," she said at last, with the pleasant warmth of someone allowing the serious part of an afternoon to conclude, "I think perhaps another cup of tea would be suitable, if anyone would like one. It has been rather a long 2 days." Mr. Whitten said that he would, and sounded very nearly relieved enough to mean it deeply. Even Mrs. Pemberley, after a moment, held out her cup. Chapter 10. Peace returned to the Meadow. The following week in St. Mary Mead passed with the thoughtful, slightly deliberate air of a village that has recently endured a disturbance and is now engaged in the careful business of resuming its ordinary self. Villages with long experience of such recoveries acquire a real skill in them. They know how to restore surface harmony without denying that something discordant has occurred beneath it. The shops opened at their proper hours. The gardens received their usual attentions. Conversations at the post office, the butcher's, and the bench outside the village hall covered the accustomed range of weather, produce, church matters, and the reliability of local tradesmen. And if certain names were mentioned slightly less often than they otherwise might have been, this was achieved with such naturalness that one could almost believe no omission had occurred at all. Miss Marple observed all this from her customary stations, the garden, the lane, the occasional walk into the village when the weather warranted the effort, with the appreciative and unhurried attention of a woman who had watched communities recover from discomfort all her life and still found the process worth studying. The missing sum was returned to the church roof fund by Tuesday. Miss Marple knew this because Mr. Parsons, the church warden, mentioned it to her on Wednesday morning in the deliberate tone of a man conveying a fact while making every effort to suggest that he was conveying nothing whatsoever. The full amount had been restored, he said, together with a somewhat additional anonymous contribution, with the result that the roof fund now stood in better condition than it had before the picnic. He found this entirely satisfactory. Miss Marple said that she did too. Mrs. Pemberley's resignation from the parish committee was submitted on Wednesday, Afternoon by letter addressed to Reverend Alderton. It cited pressure of personal circumstances and a need to reduce her commitments for the foreseeable future. Reverend Alderton read the letter in his study, filed it where such letters are properly filed, and drafted a reply expressing gratitude for her years of service in terms at once warm and tactful. It was entirely sincere, and it asked no questions whatever about the nature of the personal circumstances involved. Miss Marple, when she heard of this, thought him a very sensible clergyman. Neither letter mentioned the picnic. Neither letter needed to. In that regard, the matter was closed. Mr. Whitton's name was cleared by means that were, if not theatrical, entirely effective. Mrs. Pembley's letter had included, as Miss Marple later understood, a paragraph stating plainly that on reflection she believed the discrepancy in the donation box had arisen from an error in her own initial accounting, and that Mr. Whitton had fulfilled his responsibilities with complete propriety. Reverend Alderton communicated this to Mr. Parsons. Mr. Parsons mentioned it to Mrs. Alderton. Mrs. Alderton, being a woman of excellent social distribution and a principled regard for accuracy, saw to it that by Thursday evening the correction had reached the principal households of St. Mary Mead with a thoroughness no formal parish notice could possibly have improved upon. When Miss Marple encountered Mr. Whitton near the village green on Thursday, he had regained the unguarded ease of manner that humiliation had suppressed throughout most of the week. He stopped to speak to her about the cricket, about a new tomato variety he was attempting in his kitchen garden, and about whether the warmth might hold into August. He made no mention at all of donation boxes, parish accounts, or Mrs. Pembley. He did say, with genuine warmth and no exaggeration, that Miss Marple was looking particularly well. Miss Marple thanked him and said that she was. That was all. It was enough. On Friday afternoon, Mrs. Norwood came to see her. Miss Marple had gone out into the garden after luncheon with her knitting and the mild ambition of finally making progress on a section she had been carrying about since April. She was perhaps 20 minutes into this endeavour when she heard the gate and looked up to find Mrs. Norwood walking along the path with a tin of shortbread in her hands. She offered it with the directness of a woman, not much given to pretexts for social visits, and who had seen no point in inventing one now. "I thought you might like some," said Mrs. Norwood simply, "and I wanted to thank you." Miss Marple thanked her warmly for the shortbread, which she was genuinely pleased to receive, and asked her to sit down. Mrs. Norwood did so with her usual composed self-possession, though there was, Miss Marple thought, something in her manner now a shade less guarded than before. They spoke at first of the garden. Mrs. Norwood showed a practical and appreciative interest in it, and they discussed the difficulty of sweet peas in a dry July, and the clematis on the south wall, which had this year surpassed all previous efforts, and about which Miss Marple allowed herself to feel rather magnificent. In a natural pause, Mrs. Norwood said, "I shall continue to wear the brooch." Miss Marple looked at her with the serene attention she reserved for statements she had expected, and was pleased to hear arrive with economy. "I should think so," she said. "I wore it for Evelyn," said Mrs. Norwood. "I wore it because she wanted me to have it, and because I was fond of her. Those things remain true, whatever else has happened." She paused. "I did not wear it in order to provoke. At least, I do not believe that was ever the chief reason. I am not entirely sure there was never any satisfaction in it. I should like to be honest about that." She said this not dramatically, but with the plainness of a woman who had spent the week in private reckoning and preferred accuracy to comfort. But the main reason was always Evelyn. The most important motives generally are the simplest ones, said Miss Marple, even when one or two others have attached themselves along the way. Mrs. Norwood considered this thoughtfully. She and I spoke on Saturday afternoon after the match, she said. I saw that you did, said Miss Marple. Mrs. Norwood gave her a quick sidelong glance, the same sharp evaluating look Miss Marple had noticed before, though it now held more amusement than caution. She told me she was sorry, Mrs. Norwood said, in so many words. It cost her something. A small pause. I told her I accepted the apology. I meant it. We are not likely to become friends, but we were never truly enemies either. There is a difference. A very important difference, said Miss Marple. They sat in the garden for another quarter of an hour, while the clematis continued its silent triumph and a pair of wood pigeons held what sounded like a philosophical disagreement in the elm beyond the wall. The conversation moved easily after that, in the unforced way it sometimes does between two women of quite different temperaments who have, without intending it, discovered a genuine thread of understanding. When Mrs. Norwood rose to leave, she shook Miss Marple's hand briefly and firmly, and the pressure of it conveyed rather more than farewell. Miss Marple watched her go down the path, through the gate, and along the lane with the warm inward feeling of a woman who has seen something resolved that deserved, very much, to be resolved. Then she opened the tin of shortbread and found it, exactly as anticipated, excellent. On Sunday, the parish announcements proceeded without the slightest reference to the events of the previous week. Reverend Alderton mentioned, in his careful manner, that the roof fund had recently benefited from several generous additional contributions, and expressed thanks in terms so warm and so unspecific that no one of intelligence could fail to appreciate them. The vacancy on the parish committee was noted, and volunteers for the Autumn Fete Committee were invited to make themselves known after the service. Miss Marple sat in her customary pew and listened with the sincere attentiveness she always brought to church, though it was also true that the second lesson happened to be one she liked particularly well. Afterward, she chose the longer way home, which took her past the meadow beyond the river bend. The meadow was empty now. On that August Sunday morning, it had entirely returned to itself. The grass stood longer than it had at the picnic. The elms were deep in late summer leaf. The river flashed in the distance where the light touched it through the willows. There was no trace left of trestle tables, rugs, wicker hampers, or parish excitement. The grass had risen again over the pressed marks they had made, as grass does, with the quiet insistence of all growing things. Miss Marple stopped at the stile and looked out over it for a little while. She thought of Mrs. Pemberley at home that morning, and of how she would likely find her way in time toward a steadier version of herself. Not the exact self she had been before, which was probably impossible and perhaps not altogether desirable, but someone who had at least faced what she had done and named it honestly. In Miss Marple's experience, people who have done that are often more reliable afterward than those who never have. The facing is unpleasant. The resulting steadiness is worth a great deal. She thought of Mr. Whitton, restored now to his natural equanimity and his tomatoes. She thought of Miss Trench, whose courage had been the conscientious sort, the courage of a person who does what is right only after making sure, very carefully, that it is indeed right. Miss Marple had always thought that among the most dependable forms of courage there was. She thought of Mrs. Norwood, walking home in her church clothes with the settled composure of a woman who has nothing to defend and nothing to conceal. The meadow lay quiet in the morning light. entirely itself, and yet not quite the same. Things never are, Miss Marple reflected, after people have passed through them carrying their grievances, their pride, their evasions, and their reconciliations. Places keep such things in subtler ways than people do. Like grass pressed down and then rising again, they retain a faint memory of what has occurred upon them. If one looks carefully enough and with patience, one can still see it. She did not think this an entirely melancholy idea. Indeed, as she rested her hand upon the stile and then decided against climbing it, because the grass at the edges was still damp and her boots were not at all the right boots for a meadow, she thought it was perhaps a comforting one. It is seldom the coins themselves that cause the trouble, she reflected, as she turned back toward the lane. It is much more often the injuries to pride that are kept far longer than they ought to be. The lane curved past the post office, the bench outside the village hall, the turning toward Mr. Whitton's kitchen garden, and the neat, immaculate hedging behind which Mrs. Norwood's house stood in its usual order. The church bells had long since ceased. The service was over. The village resumed its proper Sunday rhythm, exactly as Miss Marple had always trusted it would, and in the meadow beyond the river bend there remained only the faintest echo of discomfort and a modest lesson in humility, settling itself into the summer grass like everything else that passes through a place and, in passing, becomes part of it. Miss Marple walked on in no particular hurry through the warm and ordinary morning, and was content